does a person who is born in the United States, does that person have a right to become a citizen? And this was a landmark case fought by a Chinese person and eventually a Chinese citizen. Uh, we also have the internment camps during World War II, where 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry were incarcerated. And if you know the history, 62% of these people were American citizens. We have the Korean War and the Immigration and Nationality Act that came from the Korean War in 1952. And we have a Immigration Act that resulted from the American War or the Vietnamese War. We also have the carpet bombing of Cambodia, starting in 1969, lasting for 4 years of carpet bombing of Cambodia. And most recently, we have the AAPI hate crimes, where we have over 3,000 reported cases since 2020. Okay, since last year, over 3,000 reported cases, and we all know that many of cases of hate crimes go unreported. So that is the story of Asian Americans in this country, and it's a longer story than that. This is a brief one slide synopsis of what we have here. And what we can tell is that Asian Americans have been a continued source, okay, of scapegoating, of being made invisible, being made silent in this country. And so one of the things that Vic Tan Nguyen has said, and Vic Tan Nguyen, who will visit your congregation in April, he has said that if we, Asian Americans or other minorities, do not tell our stories, someone else will tell it for us. And that's very important, because if we don't make our stories known as to where we are in this country, who we are, how we show ourselves, then someone will tell those stories for us. And often those are not the stories we want to be told about us. So I just want to move really quickly to what I would say would be Asian storytelling. How do we tell the stories that are different? And I played some jazz just before we started, because I'm sort of going improv today, since I had a whole set of things that we had in mind to be done, but we sort of pivot from that, and maybe it's a good thing. There's a Japanese storytelling technique called Kisho Tenketsu, and it's different from the Western, most Western storytelling techniques. If you remember from English classes, your teachers might tell you of a pattern, a format where you would have the introduction of characters, You would have the conflict of characters. Would have rising tension due to that conflict. You would have a climax, which is the resolution of that conflict, and you would have some falling action that comes from that conflict. Uh, Eastern storytelling is much different because the idea of conflict is not written into the Kisho Tenketsu. So, just really quickly, I'll just list the key features here. And the first one is called ki. It means a start or a introduction. Usually meaning the reason something started. We want to get the sense of why we're in the story in the beginning. The show is the summation process. After you introduce the characters, you start to learn about them. You start to learn about their life and their hardships. And then there is this turning point. The 10 is this turning point, this twist in the story because of the relationships of these characters. And the Ketsu is the result of this twist in story. And I'll just give an example of ways in which we tell the stories in the West as opposed to the East. And I'll use a biblical example since this is a course in theology. So let's say we're reading the Gospels, and I start with the exposition, the birth narratives. Okay, there's the conflict. Jesus is born. King Herod is threatened by this child, and so he asked to speak to the Magi to get information so he could kill this child. So there's a conflict later on between Jesus and the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the Roman government. The climax is the betrayal of Jesus, resulting in his death, the crucifixion. The resolution is the resurrection, where the stone is rolled away. Okay, so that encompasses sort of a Western model, and I could read the same gospel, okay, and tell the story in a different way. So I could introduce the characters like Mary and Elizabeth, like in Luke's gospel. Mary is a very prominent voice at the beginning in Luke's gospel. Elizabeth is also. And I would sum up their relationships, talking about who they are. I could talk about the relationship between Mary and Joseph and their child and how they flee their homeland and become refugees. And I could introduce a complication, a twist. Jesus ministered to those who are considered others. Why? Because he himself saw himself as othered by his community, by Rome, by several different factors. So, because he saw himself as different and other, he would minister to the other. So, there's a relationship between Jesus and the Samaritan woman, where they go to each other and speak to one another and mutually give and take from one another. And then there's reconciliation, where the women disciples care for Jesus's body. The women go to the tomb to care for Jesus. Jesus visits the disciples after the resurrection. Okay? So if you notice the way I told that story, okay, there's very little conflict in that telling. Okay. Now I want to uh, just highlight this in terms of what a Asian American theology of liberation might look like. And the first thing is that it is migrational. it is about movement and settlement and resettlement. It's about being a refugee, not having a home and finding a home, and not having place and finding a place. And theologically, we could speak about this in terms of a migratory God, a God who is not static, not at one place, but moving from place to place. If you read the Gospels, Jesus would move from place to place, from Jerusalem or Bethlehem to Egypt, from Egypt to Galilee, from Galilee to Jerusalem, from Jerusalem to Golgotha, and so on and so forth. And his movement um, are places of healing. There are places of healing. This theology is also one of in-betweenness, what is called a liminal space. Uh, when we talk about liminality, we're talking about in the middle of two or more worlds. So the Asian American experience is always one where I, okay, as an Asian American, have to situate myself in a white space and in a Asian space, in a culture that is American and a culture that is Asian. Theologically speaking, this is the idea of being between two worlds. Okay, a world of here, of this land, of this earth, of this political structure, of this social and economic structure, and also a vision of a world to come. And I want to say this, that evangelical Christians have done this pretty well. They have given a vision of two worlds. Progressive Christians, I think, need to really capture a vision of two worlds, but the vision of the other world um, should not be one of clouds and heaven and the afterlife, but it should be one of radical kinship with the sin against. Capturing that vision is very important, and unless we do that, we are not living between one world and the next. We have become settled in this world and in this place. It is about the sin against, understanding the wounds and the traumas inflicted against the Asian body in the history that I just gave you in the previous slides. Theologically, we could talk about a God who identifies and is in solidarity with the sin against, a God who has suffered um, God's own wounds, and because of that, stands in solidarity with those who are also wounded. And lastly, a theology of liberation, a Asian American theology of liberation, has this element of foreignness. Okay, the idea of foreignness is the idea of misidentifying the stranger, to look at someone and not grasp ourselves in the other. Theologically speaking, it's not being able to identify who God is. Okay, and in a way, this agnostic view, okay, is an Asian American liberative view. This not knowing whether the foreigner um, has the divine or is the divine. And you could see this in the Gospels, the narratives of the sheep and the goats, right? There's one group who are ministering to the stranger, to the incarcerated, to the sick, uh, to the foreign. And there's another group who is not doing so. But the similarity between those two groups is what? Neither one knows that the foreigner is the divine. Okay. So Jesus would say, I was a foreigner, okay, and you did not know me. So, lastly, I want to just talk about what this means for us. Okay. And we could do this by just asking a few questions. What are the points of intersection that can take place between you and those in your community? What are the intersections of woundedness? Because the place of connection that we can make with others are places of woundedness. Secondly, how can you tell your story in ways that help acknowledge and give dignity to yourself and others as divine image bearers? That's the quote from Victor Wing. I heard him say this. I'm not sure that it's in his written work, but I want to call attention to what had happened in Atlanta. That a 21-year-old Robert Long, he tells his story, and he says, "I have a sex addiction. That's why I went to these spas and killed these women." Okay, and we have Captain Jay Baker, who tells Long's story. Okay, that he was pretty much fed up uh, and kind of at the end of his rope. And yesterday was a really bad day for him, and that's what he did. So you have these two ways of telling that story, okay, that are not the stories of the victims. Those are ways to tell the story of the sinner, those who committed the crime. So the question is, who then tells the stories of the victims? So lastly, I want to ask, what ways can you position yourselves in the community so to speak truth to power and be in solidarity with the wounded? How can you place yourself in a position where your wounds are the ways in which you speak your story? You let others know what is the result of this trauma, this hurt that uh, been has been because inflicted upon you and your community. And then how can you use this wound, this trauma, to stand with others in community? So I just want to just stop right there. There are a couple ways in which we can engage in this. One is with this website, againstchristianxenophobia.com. The other with this hashtag stop AAPI hate. I would want you all to consider that. But let's stop right there and let's be in conversation about what I had just presented.
Well, Phu, as we kind of open it up to dialogue, probably the best way is if you would like to ask a question, if you are able to put your name in the chat, then we can come to you. Or if you are not able to and you raise your hand, we'll do our best to see you. Well, it's technology, but we will try our best. And Phu, I wanted to ask something you said at the end. And this is in some ways an unformed question, but it's been trying to form itself for a year. And I wonder about when you speak about our own wounds and trauma, um, and even as um, I want to stand with the Asian American Pacific Islander community in particular in this moment and in this time, I'm also aware that many people have undergone a great trauma with COVID. You know, that
Mm-hmm.
many people have suffered a wound. Um, I want to hold both of those ideas together. And I've just been wondering um, maybe what our faith has to say about um, our vulnerability. And see, this is where the question isn't quite formed, but we've all been made to feel our vulnerability in different ways, or some of us have avoided that feeling. Some of us could not avoid it or have gone more deeply into it than we ever thought. But um, I'm just working out or trying to work out what our vulnerability, how to show that, how to draw from it, how what it means. Again, I apologize. It's not very well formed, but I wonder if you have thoughts on
No,
vulnerability and woundedness.
no, that's very good. Yes, you're right. As a as a pastor and as a theologian, Jeremy, you're very right to call out the trauma that we've all endured for the last year on many levels, psychological and physical, the anxiety of living with COVID. There have been many days in which I, 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 I wondered if I caught COVID from one of my students. You know, I've taken so many tests, you know, at the CVS. Um, and that takes a toll on people, the isolation, you know, if you're not out there as a worker, as a frontline worker, there's that isolation that's traumatic too. um, and and for people uh, who are mainly, you know, in the dominant group, you know, for people who are white, um, it's it's a little, I don't want to say easier, but there are a lot more ways in which one can share woundedness and vulnerability. Um, and there are a lot of ways to receive healing uh, for that woundedness. You know, it's hard. It's hard to for all of us, regardless. It's hard to do that. But there are there are many ways though to connect in community, to connect, you know, as a church, to share, to be a part of a healing body. The other side of this is for people of color, for, you know, a BIPOC population is harder because we are already a vulnerable population, and so finding ways in community with each other to to be vulnerable is even harder, and that's why, you know, in a lot of ways, the African American church is so important. You know, that was where African Americans in the United States were able to be together, um, in you know, on the plantations. There were these things called hush arbors, where enslaved people would gather under trees, and they would sing, they would share, and they would be there for one another, uh, to provide support and healing. Later on, those places would become churches. Okay, churches will be would be built on the very same places that these African Americans would gather. And so the African American church is a very important place for the healing of wound and trauma. Um, in other communities like the Asian community, there are tight knit places to have fellowship and healing. Uh, Theologically speaking, how do we gather and show? One is a theology of woundedness, of God woundedness. And that's very difficult, even in progressive circles, to think of God who is always open, who's always vulnerable, who is able to change, who's able to love, and those things are um, very crucial to understanding how the community of God works. So without those elements of um, having a theology of woundedness, it's it would be difficult in community to do that, right? If the divine can't do that, why should we be doing it, right? John Calvin would say something like, "The wounds of Jesus were only temporary. When Jesus was glorified, he would shed those wounds. The wounds were only ways in which, through the senses of the disciples, they could come to have faith." Okay, so for John Calvin, the wounds of Jesus were not permanent. Okay, that's a real shame in Western Protestant theology, right? Um, and 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 so just thinking about how we could be together in community, and those perpetual wounds being shown, being visible, um, should be an important way in which we integrate um, our faith with our practice.
Thanks. Well, and thank you for, I mean, it's so powerful to hear as we approach Palm Sunday, you know, a wounded nation reading about a soon to be wounded Jesus. You know, I just hear it in that where we are in the calendar right now and what's happened. I see that our friend Mark Dostert has a question in the chat. So Mark, I'm really glad that you're here. It's a completely easy question, just like Mark would ask. It's not complex at all. He asked, what do you think might your and Viet Thanh Nguyen's answer be to the question of why dominant American culture often refuses to tell, refuses even to attempt to tell, and even to allow marginalized people to tell their stories. I kind of take that to mean white American culture, if I understand that. So what do you think? Why is, well,
Yeah, so I'm not going to answer for Mr. Wing. He might be able to answer that when he comes on. But for me, it is because of this idea of foreignness, right? The idea of foreignness is something that prevents us from seeing ourselves in the other. So if I see you as a foreigner, Jeremy, I don't have to see the divine image in you, and I don't have to see um, my image, which is also divine in you, also. So in that way, I prevent myself from working out, right, what I need developmentally in my life, right? So, let's say, uh, um, let's say I'm lazy. Okay, let's say I don't want to work. I just want, I just want to get my paycheck. Like a good old American, right? And and so I don't want to admit that, right? I don't want to realize that, right? I just want to sit on my lazy boy and watch, Sunday night football, and uh, eat my Cheetos. So what do I do? I say those people there, they're the lazy ones, right? They're the ones coming into this country and stealing our jobs, et cetera, et cetera. Um, but at the same time, I need them to like mow my lawns, and clean my houses, and uh, build my houses, and also reap my produce, so I could have something on the table. And you see how that works. You see how that works. So there's a constant, like, putting on the foreignness to others, so that we don't see ourselves in others, because if we do, um, then there's something that we have to work on. There's a relational value that we have to work on in order to flourish, right? To be who we truly can be in relationship. But that's too difficult. All that's too difficult. So we other people, we make them objects. We make them objects for our fantasy, our sexual fantasies, or whatever, with Asian women. We emasculate, Asian men. We give them all these stereotypes. Again, so we don't have to deal with anything with ourselves, right?
Yeah, thanks for that. And um, I can't help but put in a plug. Mark knows this, and I see dear Unitarian Universalist friends on this call. So this is coming from Sharon Welch and others, and many people here know Sharon Welch. Um, but I think just that, Mark, what you're saying is true, and also each of us can audit our reading lists, just like we audit our lives, and we can ask, whose voices are we hearing? What books are we sitting with? What stories? A book is just a way of sitting with someone and listening. And
Exactly.
books like The Mountains Sing, for example, are just can just really draw us into different lived experiences that are so powerful. So
Mhm.
forgive me for going off in that direction for a minute, but I think any of us, if we can look at who we are listening to, and in my case, I'm looking for voices that are not default straight white male Christian like me. So I'm looking for the wisdom of other lived experiences than my own. Um,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
that's that's an English major sermon. And so it's, bibliography. Sorry, Phuc, what were you intending
No,
to say?
no, no. And for me, yeah, the voices of women, the voices of minority women, for me, especially African American women, those are important voices for me.
Yeah. And
Can I make a comment,
sure, Jeannie,
Jeremy?
go ahead. Yes.
I think that is absolutely brilliant what you said, because when we're gathered in a group, suddenly there's extreme silence when people get right down to thinking about what I want to share in a certain situation about a trauma, for instance, to me, because to begin with, I feel so humble because everybody else in the group has suffered so much more. So I say, do I have a right to tell that story? When what you're saying is that is exactly what we need to do, and be honest to be able to connect, really genuinely connect with each other. And I am so thrilled also that I'm very close to a Korean family from when they came here, and they have been like children to me, and I've gotten to see them grow up and just follow their lives. And we're on Facebook. It's like my second family, and they just mean everything.
Mhm. No, that's good. And we
And
want to
their
be
story
honest.
is amazing. Their story
Mhm.
is amazing.
Yeah. Yeah, and we want to be honest with our stories also. I'm not saying we should compare our sufferings to others. Like my experience is not the same as an African American experience in the United States at all. Um, so I try to be honest with where I am in proximity to others, others who are minorities, other who are white, and so and again that's important to a Asian American theology of liberation. That's the in betweenness that I experience, and so I speak that. So I'm not trying to best my suffering, onto others. But just be honest where I am, so I could see their suffering. Because the main goal is that I could understand and have empathy and have compassion and also see that interconnectedness between all of us, right? Thich Nhat Hanh has this concept of interbeing, right? Where we know that um, all of us are woven together in a tapestry. But unless um, we see where my thread is, I won't be able to identify where you're woven into it.
It's beautiful. Thanks. I'm watching the chat and making sure. I think we have Tyler and then Phil. So Tyler, I
Hey,
go to you next.
Hey, my man Tyler, how are
how's it?
you?
I'm doing okay. How are you?
Doing well, thank you.
So I had a question. I'm especially glad that you named Kisho Tenketsu. It's a beloved form of storytelling to me, just as I care about pacifism and nonviolence. And so my thinking's a little scrambled, and I'm pulling some things in. I have known many people who are offended by a pacifist gospel. They're just offended when people try to look places other than the violence of the cross. And I can also say that I am offended at descriptions of Atlanta calling it a bad day. And so as you think about speaking truth to power, how might you go about making this judgment call of when to look at and name violence and when to look elsewhere in the narrative and find nonviolence?
Yeah, right. So yeah, to do that sort of nonviolent storytelling, Kisho Tankatsu, it doesn't necessarily mean that like the story elements don't have like um, violent features in it. No, it's just that it's not integrated. It's not a necessary part of it. So we could, when we have Eucharist, okay, we could recall that the Eucharist symbolizes the violence that has happened to this victim, right? This victim of power, both by the religious leaders and by the political elites. Um, so so in that way, we unravel, we reveal the violence that is taking place there. The the other thing is that whenever we do resistance work, there's always going to be conflict, as you just gave a example, right? MLK, whenever he did his resistance work, he was criticized um, for inviting conflict. Everywhere you go, there's bloodshed. So doing the work of passive or nonviolent resistance does not mean that there won't be any conflict. It's just that how can we position ourselves so that um, others are, um, or that the conflict is revealed to others, so that the eyes can be open. How do we situate ourselves in a way, especially you being a Asian person, Tyler, who lives in two worlds also, I suspect. How do you position yourself in a way where that violence is can be revealed to others, and so that can come in many ways. Today, during lunch, a white colleague was talking about how their daughter was going to go off to Swanee, a small liberal arts college, progressive Episcopalian, but she might encounter um, some acts of protest that might mirror Berkeley. This is the language of my white colleague, not mine. Okay, and how that might throw her daughter for a loop, and she only wants her daughter to have an education, not be subjected to a civil rights movement. And for me, I just sat there, first listened, but also questioned what things were going on. I don't know the history of the school, but I just asked questions like, if I was a African American, how would I feel to have a statue or a bust of someone who was a slaveholder there? Let's think about it another way. If I was a Jew, how would I feel if there was a depiction of a Nazi commander or swastika in the room? Just asking those questions, because I have the ability to sit in those worlds in a way that might not seem threatening, was a place for conversation for us. So so again, we can look at it as a way to argue, okay, and be in conflict with one another. I'm not sure that that's going to get us anywhere. It's very evident by that on social media. But how can we constantly be in relationship in a way where we're constantly revealing that truth.
Mhm.
So those are, I think, ideas in which we can toy with, and where we can start.
Thank you.
Hey,
There you are, Phil.
yeah, hey.
Hi.
I think you've just answered my question quite well. But my question, I was just noticing that the that the examples of the two narratives from the biblical story that you gave, the Western style story was very explicitly political, a conflict with a ruler, political power, retribution. And the Asian American story was much more personal and much more relational. And my question was, does that does that difference continue to inform current activism within the Asian American community? And I think you've begun already to answer that.
Yeah. Politics is important, right? We all, unless we decide to move off into the desert or into the mountains and become monks, and even the monks have politics within their losangas, right? We're political animals. Politics will always be a part of it. It's just how do we do politics, and so yeah, you're quite right. There's a relational way to do politics, to be in relationship and to mine, to use the resources of our person, of who we are, in relationship to one another. That I think that's very valuable, and that has been very underused. When we do these political dialogues, right? Who are we in community to one another? Who are we as father and sons and daughters and mothers and lovers and pastors, and lay leaders, and students, and learners and teachers? Who are we in all these relationships, and how we can utilize those relationships in a very valuable way to be in dialogue, to understand one another, and again, I teach at a high school, and I try to enter into this all the time as a teacher, with my students. I know I have a certain amount of power over my students, but I also know my students have a certain amount of power too. And we enter into relationships of learning, where my goal is always to decolonize their minds, but also I invite them, in order for me to decolonize their minds or their persons, I always invite them to share and be vulnerable and present who they are, right? And
Yep.
and I do this in relationship. I don't I don't deconstruct um, harshly. No, I don't hit them over the head, but I ask them questions. I relate to them. I use humor, which surprises them. I dance with them. I sing to them. Believe it or not, so that again, they know something about my humanity, and they will reveal something about theirs.
Yeah, and just a brief comment. If I think to see what storytelling, particularly stories of victimhood, looks like when it's totally divorced from personal relationships, you can look right now at how extremist white nationalists are playing the victim. They see the power in the victim narrative, but they have no interest in dialogue. They, as part of the dominant group, is nonetheless playing the victim, but it's solely on a political power level and not a personal one. Thanks for your response.
No, that's really good. That's really good.
And this is almost a segue to Andrea's comment, but I was speaking with a Jewish group earlier today and spoke about, try to be honest about all the harm that exists and the hatred that exists within the Christian tradition and the work that is ours to do. And they were relieved to hear me kind of volunteer that. I'm not trying to make myself look good in any way, but just to be honest and to start to be real and vulnerable and to name some of that. And so even name some of my grief as a person within a tradition that is so often violent, certainly in the Deep South. And that's not a good segue, but Andrea, I think, was maybe just making a comment, but certainly mentioning Christian nationalism and maybe different kinds of isolation, which have been amplified by the pandemic or exacerbated, but also I feel like we're very isolated from each other in our churches, perhaps like us from this other varieties of Christianity or news sources, the realities we construct, or it's not reality, but the worlds we construct. Andrea, if I'm off, or if you had a more pointed question, we can just chat it to us and we can certainly get to it. And Sue was also asking about our need for creating different classes, in particular lower rungs in her.
It
Yeah.
wasn't so
Go ahead.
much a question as it is a statement, because it's difficult to find a safe place. You want to be sure that people understand your position, but you don't want to create conflict, the kind of conflict it's the same kind of conflict maybe that you encounter sometimes in a store when people challenge whether you're wearing a mask or not. I mean, it's almost that within a church setting or a Sunday school setting, and it's just hard to find a safe place. And the book crew that we put together to read Jesus of the East created a very safe place. For those of us, we all trusted each other. We were able to say what we felt. And I don't know that that would have happened without the pandemic. So, we make our own safe places when we seek others and build a relationship in whatever way we can. So I'm saddened, very saddened by this division, and I'm sure it's probably in every congregation of people where there's such a division on political lines. So, which was among Jesus's disciples also. So, it's not anything new. But thank you.
And Phu, it's not a thank you for that, Andrea. It's not a small question, but I don't know if you had a thought about the way that we do class here, or even the way that we do cast, which I know is different based on Isabel Wilkerson's new work.
Yeah, any thoughts about our social economic classes? What comes to mind now is a group of kids that I work with who, for the most part, are not disadvantaged, but there are a few who are, and they're there on scholarship, and I'm honored to be with those students. The thing is that even in a school that's pretty well off, there are a lot of trauma and wounds. I have this one advisee, and she, I just love her to death. and several weeks ago, it was revealed to me that that she was hurting herself. She committed some acts of self-harm and needed uh, to have therapy, which was a great move on her part and her family's part. Um, in a lot of ways, that broke my heart. That really broke my heart. And and it did so because it just it's not that I didn't know, okay, but those are the things that some of my students are going through, and so uh, and so yeah, class is a way for us to hide and conceal a lot of our wounds and trauma. And again, um, to position ourselves in ways in which we don't have to deal with some of them. Okay, um, if if um, if we could see ourselves as better than those people there, then that means that we're okay, right? That means that we got it together. If we have a nice enough house, nice enough car, if we could go on vacation in Colorado, if we could have multiple houses, etc., etc., that means everything's all right. And more often than not, those are ways in which we cover up the messes that we have. And so that's sort of my quick and dirty commentary on class. Eh, yeah, yeah, and I'll just stop there.
And there's so much I can say. That several have recommended the book Cast so highly. So it is on my reading table, and I would commend it to the group. I think it can really change the way we see it, and takes us into new territory. So there are, how about two more questions as we kind of wrap up? And this, I have to say, group, this is these are the Meadville Lombard. It's like the alum society from Hyde Park in Chicago. So the first one is from Bill. It's,
Uh-huh.
and it says, I'm interested in your multiple expertise, in particular theology and poetry. Oh, Bill, you can speak. I'm sorry, I'm reading over you. Do you want to?
I hear your voice all the time, and I so appreciate you holding that. Yeah, this may be a bit of divergence from the theology, but I thought before you go, if you hadn't weighed in a little bit on poetry and your expertise, and both as a poet, but also knowing other poets, just who among the poets that you know are writing now that are holding that kind of, especially Christian liberatory frame. Which poets could you recommend or name that are telling, the needed stories right now for healing?
Mm.
I'll leave it at that.
Yeah. So Christian, gosh, I'm hard pressed to think of Christians who do that well. The poetry, yeah, the poetry that I read, it's like Jericho Brown, who just won a Pulitzer for his work, The Tradition, um, and and him talking about flowers and a black man owning a nice garden. Okay, um, uh, Jericho is wonderful in terms of he his sensibility is to connect, for him the black male gay body to this world in a particular way, that I really appreciate, because in order to do that, you got to be vulnerable. The other person is, Tyler knows, is Ocean Vuong, the Vietnamese poet. Um, uh, the Exit Wound book, what better title about vulnerability and woundedness? Okay. My friend D.F. Brown, he's a Vietnamese war vet, and he writes about trauma and revisiting trauma on the battlefield. Um, I and he's a Buddhist, agnostic, Christian, whatever. I don't really care. He's just a beloved friend of mine. So I'm immersed in that language, those waters, and so I'm hard pressed to find something like that that's particularly Christian. But I'm, in a way, to me, it's all particularly Christian. Um, so yeah, yeah, those are the ones who come to mind now.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Mhm.
Thanks.
And perhaps that's a good point where I may end today's meeting with a prose poem of my own.
Cool. That would be wonderful. And Phuc, we have, I think, a final question from Marcia. And Marcia, are you in Oregon? Can we go to you?
I am, sure.
Good to see you.
Good to see you too. Good to see you too. I was struck reading the sort of summary you wrote about the Gospels from kind of a white perspective and an Asian perspective, and the type of storytelling, with how much that sort of resonated with me as a woman who tells stories, and it's all about the relationships, and that's the interesting part. I kind of confess that I looked at the gospel, I'm like, oh, I guess that's what's in there, but it's not how I read it either. And so I was just curious about sort of the ways in which different groups that are not the dominant culture, although I am in many ways part of the dominant culture, in other ways I am not. And so how various ways in which we carry the non-dominant culture affect our language and affect how we talk about things.
How various ways in which we carry dominant culture. Are you talking about the culture of whiteness affects how we narrate our stories?
Yes, but I'm also talking about, coming from the perspective of a white person, but also a queer woman. And I find my stories much more narrative and relational than the way that you described white stories that feel very masculine to me.
No, that's good. And yeah, and for you in particular, your stories come from your experiences, right? And it might be that that you have taken the experiences of being colonized yourself, right? Being colonized by what? By heteronormative masculinity, and then pivoted away from that, right? And said, these are the ways in which I'm not going to tell my story, or tell your story from the relationship of that. So here is the heteronormative ways in which uh, things affect me in my life, and I can position myself in relation to that. So that in your stories you have that, and then you have you, and you tell the relational aspect, of that, which I've seen some queer writers do, and they would position themselves like that. So I think for you, you're, yes, in a great place because you can identify it in a lot of ways to this aspect of being in the liminal space, right? Being an in-betweener, right?
Yeah.
And then you could tell the narrative from one perspective, and mirroring the other, one perspective and highlighting the other one perspective, and showing the effects of the other on you and on your trauma, on your wounds. So I think when I did those presentations, that was just a way to help us decolonize our minds and our perspectives, just to unravel how we have been doing that work in our communities and in our world. It's not to say that everyone in the West does it that way.
Obviously,
Yeah, yeah, and that's wonderful. That's wonderful that you are in a position to narrate your lives in ways that are different. And I would hazard to say that comes from your experiences, who you are, your identity, and that's wonderful.
Yeah. Thanks. And thanks to all. It's just so good to see so many dear people from all over. And I think, but Phu, I would like you to close us, and to have the last word. I just wanted to briefly name the next date is something that I would like you to keep. And if we have your email already, we will be sending you more. If we don't have your email, Catherine, would you put an email into the chat that people can use to get information about speakers? So our next speaker, and we're extremely excited about this, April 29th and 30th, so a little over a month from now, we'll have distinguished guest lectures with Viet Thanh Nguyen, who, again, we'll send you a lot of information about this, but he's a Pulitzer winner, and more importantly, just a brilliant ethicist and an anti-colonial ethicist. He uses a lot of humor and to help make some very prophetic points. So his fiction is wild, as you know, and his nonfiction, the book Nothing Ever Dies, is an extremely powerful book about memory and storytelling. So we will send you more, but for now, please let us know if you'd like to be on the list, and also mark your calendars for April 29th and 30th. And with that, there's a list from, there's email information from Catherine in the chat. But with gratitude to all, let's, and especially with gratitude to Phu for guiding us tonight and leading us. Phu, let's let your prose poem.
If you don't mind, I'll just read from in two places. I just read very short excerpt from the book, and then pause for a second, and then the prose, if you don't mind the prose poem. Are you still there, Jeremy?
Still there. Yes.
Oh, okay. Did you mind or you didn't mind?
No, I'd love to. No.
um, so this is a very at the very beginning of the book, in this section called "Between Two Worlds." Okay, so I thought it would be apropos to read that. With a squeak of tires, the plane landed on the tarmac at Hanoi. 44 years had passed since my parents and I left our native land of Vietnam. This trip with my wife, her parents, and a handful of friends was my first time back to the place we had fled. We decided to begin our journey in the north, the region not of my birth, but of my ancestry. My father's family had moved south to be a part of the war between brothers and sisters and countries near and far. For some, this war is a long faded memory, but it still holds much trauma for me and for many others. As writer Vic Thanh Nguyen reflects, all wars are fought twice, the first time on the battlefield, the second time in memory. Vietnam is a battleground of memories. Before Saigon fell, we left by plane in the dark of night because my father was a lieutenant colonel in the South Vietnamese Army and my mother worked at Trans World Airlines. We had relatively little trouble making it out with the first wave of refugees. Many others were not as fortunate. Some who exited on boats never made it to a safe shore. Vessels were seized by pirates. People were taken into slavery, their bodies used to appease the gods of punishment and suffering. But that was the history of our people, of many conquests and wars, and of fleeing. I do not know how deeply the war entered my soul as a 4-year-old boy. Did the trauma of war leave a mark on me like the bombs that scarred our land? Just as my grandfather's imprisonment by the communist government left an indelible mark on my father? Were the wounds of my parents passed down to me not like old recipes, but like disgraceful things one hides away, never to be discussed? But that day, over 4 decades later, I returned to the land of my ancestors, to the north, where my father and his parents come from. It was not until towards the end of our tour that a bittersweet feeling settled in. I was no longer Vietnamese, but Vic Q, a foreigner, a Vietnamese person living abroad. A point made by the Vietnamese nationals after they heard my American accent. You're Vic Q. Yes, I would respond with slight embarrassment. I am now Vietnamese American, between two worlds. I'm not a citizen of one country, nor am I entirely accepted by the other. In the United States, people still ask, where are you from? And I respond, from Houston. But this question is intended to draw attention to my difference, as if we did not share the same love for barbecue brisket, the same excitement when the Astros won the World Series, the same flooded roads and houses 3 years in a row. I am an in-betweener. That's exactly the way that Jesus calls his disciples to live, existing between one vision of the world and another. Jesus was not a patriot of Rome, nor was he a teacher of Jewish orthodoxy. He was crucified for being both a traitor and a blasphemer. Jesus had no allegiance to the empire of Rome, nor to the earthly Zion. Neither were his home. Rather, he longed to dwell with his people, to live among those who needed him and loved him. He who eternally danced with the Father and Spirit now entered another dance, not with humanity in general, but with specific humans in particular. He became brother and friend, teacher and student, co-conspirator and comrade. He ate with them and laughed with them and cried with them, struggled with them and bled with them. Their voice was his. He could not be separated from them. Yet he was always foreign, always a stranger in this world. This is called Mango Greens. Seawater lapping the Miami beaches, kissing sand and toes as my brother and I play thousands of miles from a similar coast. That was my cay named China Beast by American troops in Da Nang, Vietnam. Those white sandy dunes, the rhythm of waves over and over again, they are reminders of war, of dashed hopes, dissolving sand, of another world, the washing up of things by the tide, calling, echoing. My mother was taking classes to be a beautician, a hairstylist in the United States. In our homeland, she was working an administrative job at Trans World Airlines and was cultivating a career before the American War. Here in America, my parents had to start all over, without language, without a culture, with only what we could carry in suitcases and cardboard boxes, filled and taped and flown across the ocean. What is the distance and measure across a person's soul? How is it traversed, if not by fear and courage? After her classes, my mother would meet me at school and we would walk home together. In the sun of spring, her hand clutching mine, I would look up to see the brightly colored houses in the neighborhood and hear the sounds of Cuban music, of rustling palms, and the smell, the aroma of food I've yet to taste, rising from backyard barbecues. We come across a mango tree that reached across a brick wall, one hand dangling out to say hi to shake ours. My mother stretched out to grab a yellow fruit that fit perfectly in a palm, plucking it as a gift, an offering to us, given back from God. She peeled the soft, fibrous skin, opening it like a banana and giving it to me. I took a bite of the soft flesh, its yellow nectar dripping the color of the Saigon sunset. Continuing to walk with my mother, still holding her hand and savoring my snack, we make it to the house where we were renting at that time, and I almost make it to the pit of that fruit. It would be only several more months of these walks, of hearing my father trying to learn Spanish, to speak to our neighbors, of beaches and blue waters, of sleeping on a towel in the parking lot when we needed to wait for my mother to finish her classes. Soon we will have to move again, wandering immigrants in search of work and home. But those were times when my little body needed to adjust, to become acclimated to foreign soil, to a different land, to be accustomed to the shock of abandoning home in the middle of the night, the sound of bombs falling, the eager energy of fleeing, becoming sudden refugees, to enter a land where the waters knew no difference between the shore of one place and the shore of the next. Thank you, friends. Much love to you as you tell your stories, stories of tenderness, stories where the wounds are, stories where the flesh comes together. Peace and love.
Amen. Thank you so much, Phuc, for being with us. And
You're welcome.
Zoom lets us be here like this, but we still live hopefully of seeing each other in a closer way too. So thanks everyone for being here tonight, and peace be with you.